Hello, you are listening to an archived worship service of First Presbyterian Church, Columbus, Mississippi. Thank you for listening.
So truthfully, how many of you have been listening to Christmas songs on the radio? We all know the radio station that's been playing them since before Thanksgiving, right? It's been on in my car every day since around Thanksgiving. We've been listening to all the Christmas songs, many of those which we've known our entire lives. You can sing along with almost every single one that comes on the radio, and that's what I do. So if you see me at a stoplight, you're going to see me singing the entire month of December because I'm singing along with all the songs in the car. And Michael and even Henry now know that Dad is going to sing the whole time we're in the car. So this last week I was doing that. I was singing along like I have been for this whole last month, and everything's going fine until I looked in the back seat and this guy right here has this shocked look on his face. Then I realized what I'm singing. I saw Mommy kissing you know who. And I'm singing at the top of my lungs. And a 6-year-old's eyes are huge. Because maybe for the first time in his life, he's hearing all of these words. Scandal. We had to talk about what all that meant. Mommy was saying thank you. It's okay. Scandal. In the back seat of the car, the eyes that were popping out of his head, I have to think that those same eyes, that same scandal, that same fear, that same misunderstanding is how we start our gospel reading today. You see, we forget that the gospel starts with scandal because we just jump right ahead. We know how it ends, so we're going on well past that whole beginning part where everything is shocking. Matthew begins his gospel with this long list. Do you remember? It's the list that the youth preached from at their youth service just a couple months ago. The one that was read so expertly by Meg Waits. She did such a great job, a studious job of pronouncing all those really hard names. It's a long list of begats, mothers and fathers, and who has who, and onward through the generations. That's how Matthew begins his gospel, of telling us the whole lineage. And then we get to this verse where it is Joseph's turn. Except there's scandal. Joseph's turn has been marred. Joseph's turn to be on that list that he had memorized since his birth, the one that showed that he was a descendant of David, and now it's skipping him. The list of long history, the prestige of being a descendant of a king, is now marred by these simple words. But before they lived together, Mary was found with child. His mark, his time, his list, and it wasn't his. Now, the other thing that we know about Joseph from this text, other than the fact that It's no longer his list, that long list of begats, as Joseph is righteous. He is a righteous man. Matthew makes that statement, but then tells us what that means. He simply can't go on. He can't go through with this wedding. You see, righteousness is a word that we find quite a bit in the Hebrew Scriptures, and it's almost always connected with or interchanged with the word justice. It is a law word. He was a guy who followed the rules. That's what this means. And he did what was right. He did what was just. It was lawful. By the codes of his people and his God, he followed the rules of his society. And the rule was to put Mary aside. And frankly, that's the kindest outcome that was allowed. If he so desired, there were many more gruesome and destructive paths that righteousness could take. Now, I don't know about you, but I grew up believing that Joseph married Mary, took Jesus as his son out of his righteousness. I thought righteousness is what led to Joseph deciding to take Jesus as his son. But if we read the gospel closely, that's not what it says. In fact, it reveals to us exactly the opposite. Righteousness told him to walk away, told him to find another way to keep his list. So what changed? What makes the difference when Joseph wakes up? It wasn't righteousness that changed. It was something more. You know, our lives are hemmed in by the structures that are all around us, rules and laws. The Scriptures are full of these. Our society is full of these. Now, we can choose to follow those rules, or with God's great gift of free will, we can even choose not to follow those rules. But not following those rules always has consequences. Whether we're talking about the rules of Scripture or we're talking about the rules of our society, I don't have to tell you, if you are speeding down the road, you are likely at some point to pay a fine. If you break a promise to a friend, there will be some sort of pain involved in that relationship. Joseph knew that. He was righteous. If you don't follow the rules, there will be consequences. Over the last few years, I've followed a story of a minister. He was a Mennonite minister, lived up in Pennsylvania. In fact, he lived in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. His name is Chester Winger. He was once the minister at the prominent Blossom Hill congregation. Now, the part of the Mennonite family that he belonged to was very orthodox. That's his word. They followed the rules. There was no deviation. They were righteous. It was a strict Christian community. His lineage was absolutely Mennonite royalty. His family had started seminaries. His parents, his mother, in fact, had helped guide a lot of the communities in the early days, their time in Lancaster. Chester was, by all accounts and by every person you would ask, a righteous man. And it was one day that his son had something to tell him in the church, and the church cast him out. You see, in that Orthodox tradition, they could not have his son there any longer. Chester understood. In fact, he supported the righteousness of the decision that had been approved by the church that day. But he followed his son out into the parking lot and he said, "The church will fail you, but do not give up on Jesus." Years went by, and every time he saw his son, he would beg him, "Do not give up on Jesus." Over the years, more sons and more daughters would be cast out of their community, all in the name of righteousness. And Chester would tell each of them, the church will disappoint you, but do not give up on Jesus. The community gave up on them, but he begged. The church gave up on them, all in the name of righteousness, as Chester would tell the story years later, until one night he and his wife sat at home reading Scripture together. It was one night that they opened up their Bible to Romans chapter 1, and he said these words would make all the difference. "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes." He had been begging all of these years for all of these people who had been cast out by his community not to give up on Jesus, and he started to realize something. That he had valued his community over Jesus. He had valued his own righteousness over Jesus. It was not those who left that needed to be begged to not give up on Jesus. It was he himself. Chester says it is in that moment that he discovered something more true than orthodoxy. He discovered, after 60 years of ministry, Jesus. Now, for his stand in his community, he was defrocked. After 60 years of ministry, he was defrocked, and he accepted the consequences and bears no ill will to his community, even to this day. He found something more than righteousness for the love of a son. For all the sons and all the daughters that the community had let go of, all that they had abandoned. I think he found the same truth that Joseph did when he woke up that next morning. That righteousness will fail us. But Jesus will not. The angel revealed to Joseph and to us who this child is, but more importantly, what this child means. Isaiah said, "You'll call him God with us." The angel told Joseph, this is God saving us. This is, in fact, God's saving act in humanity. And it is more important than your rules. It is more vital than your righteousness. The scandal of a broken family tree and the heartache of a son cast out Jesus can take all of that, and even all of our righteousness and our rule-keeping, our orthodoxy, and transform it into something more. Something here. Something enfleshed. Something personal. Something we can touch and feel. Something we know even more deeply than we know ourselves. Christmas, then, is not a call to orthodoxy. It's not about the candles we light and the order we light them. Christmas is not about keeping the rules. It's about something far greater. It's not something we can even attain. It is something awakened in us, just as it woke with Joseph that morning. Christmas is a love that is poured out on creation, God's ultimate act of revelation to us. And in that revelation, we know God more perfectly than we can ever know God by following the rules. God with us. God save us, even from ourselves. John will call this in his gospel the light that came into the world. Chester Winger would call it the graciousness, the generosity of God. Joseph simply woke up, and the world was different. His list transformed into not who he was, but who he will be. The one who gives Jesus his name. The one who obeys even at great cost. Joseph's not who he thought he would be, but something far greater. Now you might believe it's scandalous, but Joseph did not follow the law. And Christmas is not about calling you to follow the law either. Chester Winger didn't. And for that, he paid consequences. And for it, we will as well. But there is something far more out there for each of us than righteousness. There is Jesus. Perhaps this Christmas we might reconsider all the things that we've done in the name of righteousness, all the ways that we've stood our ground because we are right, or we've stood our ground because of a rule. Perhaps we could lose a little of our orthodoxy. Perhaps they won't say of us, that was one righteous bunch. Perhaps they'll say, that was a group that knew Jesus. They understood that God has come to dwell among us. And in that, God saves us. Perhaps we can let go a little bit of our righteousness this Christmas. Joseph did, and it changed the world. We could be like Paul, who stands before groups of those who think he's lost his mind. He says simply, I'm not ashamed of Christ. I'm not ashamed of it. It calls me into something different, something bigger, something better than what I knew before by simply following the rules. I am not ashamed of Christ, for that is the power of God to save us. Paul wakes up. Chester woke up. We wake up. Joseph woke up. We awaken to God at work in the world. A God that saves us. Let's wake up. Thanks be to God. Amen.